It's in the club, guys, with one of the most eagerly awaited in the clubs we've had in a while. I'm talking Fulham. I'm talking with Jack Collins of the Ranks FC podcast and, of course, the Fulhamish podcast. Jack, welcome to the show. How are you?
I'm brilliant, thanks. Thanks for having me on. It's a real pleasure, and I've been awaiting this as eagerly as you, I think. So I'm really excited.
Brilliant, brilliant. Jack, let's start with I suppose, full disclosure, guys. Transfer deadline day. Is Antonee Robinson going to Manchester City?
Bloody hope not. Would be my first take on that, because Layvin Kazar was the only backup, and considering how he's performed this season, I don't think that's a situation that Fulham will want to be left in. I'd be very surprised if Fulham accepted a bid. I think they might say to Antonee Robinson, "Look, if City still want you in the summer, we'll happily sell you, but with 6 hours to go." No formal bid lodged. I can't see Fulham sanctioning that deal. Just there's not enough space or time to get a replacement in. So I think he'll stay, although I do think clubs will come calling again for Antonee Robinson, considering how he's performed this season. But for now, I think he'll be at the cottage for the second half of this season.
Yeah, and just generally speaking, do you see him as a Pep Guardiola style footballer? Could he come in and slot into the kind of system that Pep plays?
I think it'd be very interesting to see how he developed, because he's been a very kind of round the outside footballer. So actually, if you look back and you look how City used to play when, and apologies for mentioning his name, but when Benjamin Mendy used to play in that left back role, that's exactly the kind of system I can see Antonee Robinson filling in. But since then, it's been a very different system. Zinchenko, Cancelo inverting inwards. So unless Pep has decided that he suddenly wants to go back to flying fullbacks around the outside, then I'm not sure how it works. But Pep tends to have a better handle on these things than most. So maybe he sees a way of going again. Maybe he's seen everyone else start to invert their fullbacks on the back of City doing it last year, and he's gone, right, we're going back to basics. We're going back to flying down the flanks and hitting the byline. So I suppose so, but I think it would take a change back to an old sort of City system if Antonee Robinson was really going to thrive, because going inside, he has been quite ball clumsy pretty much throughout his career at Fulham.
So let's go to Fulham in general. How shocked are you by this pretty great season they're having so far? Was anyone expecting this?
No, if we go any further up the table, I'm going to get a nosebleed. So it does feel like it's one of those where Fulham have started so well and been so cohesive. And I think more than anything, the league table often is a little bit deceptive, especially in this range between sort of 12th and 7th, I would say. And especially with Chelsea and Liverpool kind of dragged into that mire. It's quite hard to look at it and be like, oh, Fulham going to finish 7th. But I think generally the most impressive thing about this campaign is that aside from the Newcastle game at Craven Cottage, where Fulham went down to 10 men after about 10 seconds, no one has completely and utterly railed Fulham. Basically, nobody has come and or played against Fulham and taken us and put us to the sword, and that I think is the most impressive thing in a season where obviously you're going to lose games, and Fulham have lost last minute to games in terms of Newcastle away, City away, Man United at home. There have been these kind of falling down moments, but generally Fulham have been competitive toe to toe in every game. And I think that's been the best thing about this season. I'm going into this second half not necessarily worried about the fact that Fulham will be competitive. And I think if we're competitive in games, there'll be more than enough to stay up. But yeah, I think every Fulham fan would have taken 17th on goal difference at the start of this year, just to stop the cycle of down and up and down and up. And much was made of that yo-yo kind of tag.
Right.
I think it was perhaps a little bit overplayed in the way that it was actually set up. But generally, I think to be able to stop that rot and be able to settle back into a Premier League season, obviously it's going to be a hard slog wherever the season is. But to be able to go, right, we've stayed up, we've got some consistency, and we're looking upwards instead of trying to bounce between divisions at every possible opportunity, I think is such a nice place to be in at this point in the season.
So Marco Silva, derided when he went into English football, did enough at Hull despite relegation to kind of get that vibe that he could do something at a bigger side, goes to Everton, doesn't quite work out. And now this kind of revival at Fulham. What's he done to Fulham, and what's his qualities as a manager?
I think that there's lots of bits. I think generally it's easy to forget that Marco Silva in his first year at Everton steered them to 7th and actually finished the season really strong. And yes, when he was sacked, they were in the relegation zone, reasonable. I don't think that was necessarily a bad decision. someone did point out that since Marco Silva left Everton, and in the 2 years that he's been at Fulham, Fulham have scored more league goals than Everton have in that time, which is a nice little tidbit of information just to kind of keep on the side. I think generally he has brought in a core of players who believe in exactly how he wants to play. And he hasn't shied away from the idea that Fulham are going to come to the top flight and continue to play his style of football. So when the Fulham have come up before under Slavisa Jokanovic the first time, and then under Scott Parker, especially under Parker, and Jokanovic didn't get long in the Premier League before Fulham went ultra defensive, bring in Ranieri and try and grind out 1-0 wins, try and grind out 0-0 draws away from home. Parker did much the same. And I think what's been so refreshing is that in the Championship, Marco Silva let Fulham absolutely off the leash. He went and said to the front three, Harry Wilson, Alexander Mitrovic, and Neeskens Cabano, you'd argue at least two of those, but probably all three are better than Championship quality players.
Sure.
And he went, like, go and have fun. And Fulham took that gleefully and basically ran with it. And I think it was the first time in ages that shackles been taken off. And we've come into the Premier League and you actually look at it and there hasn't been any kind of, there's obviously been adaptations in style. You can't play exactly the same way when you're battering teams 7-0 every week to what you can in the Premier League. But he hasn't withdrawn that ability of Fulham to just kind of go and create when the opportunities arise. There's been no take your foot off the gas pedal and try and grind out a 1-0. There is go and get the second. And I think Fulham have bought into that. When Fulham were up in the Premier League, especially the first few years in sort of 2001 and that first stint in the Premier League, a lot of Fulham's play was quite joyful and off the cuff, and they were quite a swashbuckling team. It was very, counter punches and playing through opposition. That had been taken away, that identity, I think, in recent years. And Silva has reignited it in perhaps the nicest possible way, and then taken that quality and believed in it in the Premier League. And that's what we're seeing the results of, I think.
You hear a lot of stuff from fans, like the Tottenham fans, they love entertainment, and Everton fans, they like the dogs of war. There's all these kind of tropes that go around. But at Fulham, it does seem to apply, because we think of Fulham in the 70s, maybe with Rodney Marsh, George Best, brief stint there.
Right.
And we think of a certain style of play. And even then when Keegan, when they got that injection of money, from the Al Fayeds, there was this kind of perception that Fulham, they may not be good, but they will play good football. Does that still remain? Is that an expectation of the fans?
I think it helps. It helps when you're in bad periods. If you go through 3 games and you lose each of them narrowly, but you've played well in all 3 of them, I think it's easier to stomach than when Scott Parker was in and Fulham were playing in the Championship. And I use the Championship windows kind of seasons as examples, because I think it's slightly easier, in that Parker would sit on a 1-0 win against Barnsley at home. And whilst that's fine, and the 3 points are the same 3 points, whether you do that or not, with the squad that he had at his disposal, it felt like he was hugely limiting the creative options. Whereas I think with Silva, he's gone, go and hammer someone. And, I think there was a period last January, Fulham won 7-0, 6-2, 6-2 in 3 games on the bounce. And everyone was kind of shocked, flabbergasted. But I think that gives you then a little bit more credence if there are defeats. You slip to a 1-0 defeat away from home against opposition you think you should beat. And you look back and you go, well, we've been all right in the last 3 games, haven't we? So it's probably going to be all right. Whereas I think under Parker, it felt very different in the way that it was like, well, we just edged past Barnsley, so now we've lost to Derby away. There's no kind of give in the fan base in terms of what their expectations are. So yeah, I think that there's definitely a point to it. And I think it probably helps a little bit, especially when you are a club that aren't going on necessarily to challenge for things at the sharp end.
Right.
I think having that identity, and I've spoken to Norwich fans about this in the past, where their identity was always about bringing through young players and trying to play football the right way, similar vibes. And a lot of people kind of ridiculed for them that because they were relegated and bottom of the league and all of those things. But it was that you can cling on to when you are bouncing between divisions. And I think there's something probably a little bit similar at Fulham.
There are, to my mind, 2 relics of a bygone era at Craven Cottage. One is the actual cottage dating back to the 17th century. Very important historical point there. And that is protected, may not be touched. And then there's another one who is a throwback, Alexander Mitrovic, a dying breed, that kind of number 9 centre forward who is bulky, stocky, strong, has an incredible skill level, amazing first touch, and scores brilliant goals. Do you consider yourself blessed to have this guy at your club?
Oh, absolutely, 100%. I think the official term is San Alexander in many places, but yeah, I think when you're looking at it, and it's an interesting one because I think you're absolutely right about it being a throwback. And then I look at the Premier League and I look at European football as a whole, and you go, hang on, everyone's after number nines again all of a sudden. And I wonder if, they always say, don't they, that football is cyclical. There are no new ideas, just different interpretations of the old ideas. And I think that what we're seeing is this kind of sudden reclamation of the number nine in these sides, and Mitrovic has just been plugging away doing his thing for so long. And I think that there are certain elements of him which definitely are very, very old school. There are certain elements of him which are very, very sharp as well, and new school. And I think we saw this under Silva last year. For the first time, he wasn't just a goal threat. He suddenly became a creative force as well. And he was dropping into spaces, learning his own limitations as well, which I think is important. He's never been a player that can run off the shoulder of the last defender because he's simply not quick enough. And suddenly you go, Silva's gone, right, stop doing that. It's silly because you never get there. Drop into spaces, and Harry Wilson and Fabio Carvalho are going to run in front of you. And all you're going to do is flick the ball over the top for them. Suddenly he's picked up 7 assists. And you're like, oh, okay, right. This is new. We haven't seen this element of Mitrovic before. So I think we're getting a kind of dual sword in many ways. One, you get the old school. He's going to batter your defenders at the back post. The ball is going to be pitched up to him, and he's going to win those headers, and he's going to, score those goals. But secondly, as you say, that first touch and ability to bring others into play feels like a new dimension to his game. And I think it's really brought that all-round game into its own kind of focus this year. And suddenly no one's saying he can't do it in the Premier League anymore, which is a welcome relief in many ways.
Someone who people had doubts over doing it for his country, and possibly, I guess I'm going to ask you that question for Fulham. When you considered Tim Ream, 35, coming into this season as your centre back in the Premier League, like we honestly thought he was done with the United States, albeit he'd been played out of position in his last games. But there'd been such a gap between those games, we didn't think he would play in the World Cup. But was there the similar concerns amongst Fulham fans for what was going to happen this season with Tim Ream? And I suppose to add to that, are you absolutely shocked by what you've seen in this kind of Indian summer to his career?
I wouldn't say necessarily shocked, but I do think those fears were definitely there. And I think part of it is the fact that Tim Ream never really got an opportunity in the Premier League. The last 2 times that Fulham came up, he was basically replaced in the squad straight away.
Right.
He got a little bit of a go the first time round under Jukanovic and Ranieri, but under Parker, he was pretty much dropped straight away for Joachim Andersen, who came in. And so all of his really commanding, imperious performances in Fulham shirts have come in the Championship. And when you kind of see that and you go, okay, so he's come in under Marco Silva. Is he going to want a younger centre-back? No chance. He comes in and Tim Ream becomes the bedrock of that side that goes up in the Championship. And you look at that and you go, okay, we're going to get to the Premier League. Are we going to see the same thing again? And I think a lot of people thought that because Tosin Adarabioyo was excellent last year. Although I think Manny would say that Ream was the better defender. There's that kind of younger element of Tosin that kicks in. And then Issa Diop was signed in the summer to, you would assume, partner Tosin. Instead, they rotate to partner Tim Ream, who remains, the heart and soul of this side in so many ways. And when you just look at these performances, it's everything you were seeing in the Championship, but suddenly it's being done at the highest possible level. And, maybe it is one of those cases. I'm now loath at some point. It's one of those weird things where you go, well, next summer, surely we're going to have to buy a centre-back because Tim Ream surely can't do this again. But why not? Because he's done it so many times already that kind of maybe you're just going fine wine, Scottish whiskies, Tim Ream, things that just continue getting better with age. So I think it's been incredibly impressive. It's so much credit to him. His work rate, his application on the training field is something that Silva's talked about so many times. And he has been a genuine, absolute hero at Fulham for so many years that it's really lovely to watch. And that kind of bond and affiliation he has with the fans. It's lovely to see that getting, as you say, an Indian summer because just of the way that he has conducted himself during his entire time. He was never, he wasn't brought in necessarily as a starter. People thought he might be a left back. Wow. People weren't quite sure what he did. He was dropped in seasons gone by for, the likes of Michael Madden and Dan Burn, who at the time wasn't the Dan Burn you know and love today. But he's just continued plugging, continued working hard, and got his head down and made himself indispensable. And I can't credit him enough.
Final one on Fulham for me. Just I wanted to ask, because I was listening to a conversation the other day, and it was that this is the season of the well-run club, of your Brentfords, of your Brightons, of your Fulhams. And I thought, yeah. And then I paused and I thought about Fulham, because it wasn't so long ago that was not the case. And that, in fact, ownership was making changes behind the scenes. There was a director of football who was sacked. There was all sorts going on. Maybe you can shed a bit of light on that. Where are the club now in terms of the way they're run, and the terms in terms of the perception of the supporters of the ownership?
Yeah, it's a really tricky one, because in the first years of the Khan era, Shah Khan and his son Tony, there was pretty much just chaos behind the scenes at all times. We had all sorts of people turning up, all sorts of people being employed. We went through a cycle of managers in really quick succession. There were accusations being thrown around in the media, in the press. It was all very dirty laundry in public.
Right.
And there has been a perception of Tony Khan, who is director of football operations, I believe, as a kind of, okay, I'm just going to ask the machine what the machine thinks. And it's not the nuance that's used with statistical recruitment in the way that Brentford and Brighton have done so well. And it does pain me to say that about Brentford. But it's one of those where I think, from my perception of it at the very least, Tony Khan has realized that there were mistakes made. He's realized that the systems that were in place weren't perfect. And he's done a very good job in the last 2 seasons of recruitment in bringing in players that not only the manager wants and kind of wants to work with, but also can fit the statistical models and do look like players that Fulham can progress and either sell on for profit or are going to become key parts of the cog at Craven Cottage. And you look at some of the deals that were picked up last summer. Andreas Pereira, everyone thought that's a bit of a strange signing to replace Fabio Carvalho, has been absolutely dynamite. Bernd Leno, I think most people are pretty happy with that signing. But when you consider that Arsenal sold him to Fulham for, I'm pretty sure, like 3 hot dogs and a packet of Haribo, it does look like probably one of the signings of the season in the Premier League, full stop, never mind, just at Craven Cottage. And I think that when these players have been brought in, Issa Diop as well, Joao Palhinha, who has been Fulham's player of the season by an absolute distance. And you kind of start to see a notion happening. Even Willian, right, who was it was lambasted, that signing by everybody. But Fulham clearly saw something, and Marco Silva clearly saw something. And what I think the backroom staff or the front of house, if you will, have done well in recent years is started to communicate better with the management about what they actually want and the players that are wanted. And instead of everyone having to go through a rigorous 2-box tick system, I think there is a little bit of space now for Marco Silva to go, I want this player and I think it's a good deal, we should bring him in. Whereas I think beforehand that there was a kind of rift there between the team management and the people in charge of the club. So I don't think it's a case of just let the manager get whoever he wants. I think there is still a back-end process at Fulham that is now starting to work a little bit better. But I think there has been a little bit more compromise between the two sides in building something. And I think that's what makes Fulham at the moment on the pitch a very well-run club.
Jack, you've been brilliant with your time. There was one thing I wanted to mention, which was off topic from Fulham. The Ranks FC podcast, you guys did a film, which I have yet to watch, but I am going to watch it, which has kind of got me excited, about Athletic Bilbao. Do you want to tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, so we went to Athletic Club in Bilbao with New Balance in November, end of October, just before the World Cup. We made a little 15-minute mini documentary about the club and about the history and what the club stands for. So it was a lot of fun. It was our first ever documentary. And it's on the Ranks FC YouTube channel. It's called Born, Bred, Basque. Because if anyone fancies having a look at that, I would be very much appreciative. It's something we're very proud of. So thank you, JJ. I really appreciate that.
No. I'm curious to watch it because of you guys, but also because of that club and the unique model they operate. And it's weird for us as Premier League watchers to even think of a model like that, right?
Yeah, it's really strange. And it's one of those where you see, I think of all the clubs in the world, although I think Benfica might be giving them a run for their money at the moment, in terms of transfer release clauses, it is very much you pay what we ask for or you don't. and you don't get them. And because there is, they can obviously recruit from Real Sociedad, from Osasuna, from a few others who have Basque-born players, but not many clubs have those, and the cost quite a lot. So they're not that interested in transfer fees because they're like, what are we going to do with it? We can't spend that much on a player who is a superstar. So when the superstars come, they tend to stick around. And I think it's an incredible model. And, there's been accusations in the past that it's xenophobic. I don't think it feels like that from a kind of perspective of being within it. It's very much about building a community club. And I think it's a really, really interesting watch and a real split between the kind of commercial world of football as we know it, and then this kind of old school idea of what a club should be and what it should represent. And that Athletic are very much of Bilbao. They represent Bilbao. The people of Bilbao support the club. They don't go off to become Barcelona or Real Madrid fans. It is very much a one club town. And I think that it's just a really, really interesting vibe when you stack it up against the idea of, we're recording this on deadline day, where I'm watching people throwing mad money around for mad things. And it's a mad day generally. And you don't get that at Athletic. They're just like, no, it's all right. We recruited someone from the academy at the start of January. We're not that stressed. So it's a nice counterpoint.
A wonderful Todd Bowley-less world that they inhabit out there. Yeah.
Indeed.
Jack Collins, Ranks FC podcast. Guys, go have a listen to that. And of course, Fulhamish, which is essential listening for our Fulham listeners and supporters in America. Jack, thanks again.
No, thank you, JJ. I really, really appreciate it. Thanks for having me on.